As we have seen in the past 2 weeks, we've looked at how DNA mutations arise and how that affects cancer. So, just to remind you again, cancer is a heterogeneous disease. That means there's an accumulation of multiple mutations. And these mutations dictate how that cell behaves. And tumors are not simply a group of cells that divide uncontrollably, but actually it's a very complex tissue. And this has different cell types, all of which actively work with each other. As you can see from this figure, there are several mutations that arise in this tumor. And what these mutations ultimately do is affect how the cell responds. It affects the regulatory circuits that dictate how that cell behaves. No cell lives in isolation. It depends on signals that come from either from a neighboring cell or from the environment or from within itself. And cancers arise because there are more than at least 100 different types of cancers, each of which has different types of mutations. So tumors are essentially complex tissues. They're not simply a group of cells that divide uncontrollably, but they're a mixture of different cell types which actively work together to make sure that the tumors grow and develop. What a cell does depends on signals it receives from outside or inside the cell, and this dictates the behavior of the cell, whether it divides or stops dividing, etc. And if you go back to the analogy of the electronic circuit, any change in this circuit, if there's any switch that is off or on at the inappropriate time or place, then this affects the entire circuit. And DNA mutations do exactly that. They affect the signals that are switched on or off in these cells. Since there are more than 100 different types of cancers and there are so many organs, most organs will contain tumors that could be of more than one subtype, and this raises several questions. How many of these circuits can be broken in order to change a cell or transform a cell from a normal cell to a cancerous one? Is there a common regulatory circuit that can be broken and which is common among different types of cancers? And the idea behind this is if you can find a common regulatory pathway, then in terms of therapy, a target can be designed primarily for this pathway. And lastly, which of these circuits are broken inside the cell and which of these are broken outside the cell? So what is this link between the external and the internal signals that dictates cell behavior? And the best way of explaining this concept is using some of the key pathways that we know are involved in cancer development. So this is the molecular genetics of cancer. And I can explain this using a simple traffic light analogy. So out of the several pathways, the first one is when a normal cell usually waits for a signal, a go signal, before it divides. So it waits to see if the conditions are right, if the DNA has divided, if the cytoplasm has appropriate components, and only then will it divide. A cancer cell, on the other hand, does not wait for the signals. They produce their own proteins or signals that enable it to continue dividing. The second pathway is in terms of stop signals. So again, a normal cell will be controlled by its environment, intracellular or extracellular. And if the environment isn't right, a normal cell will pause before it divides. A cancer cell, on the other hand, will not obey these signals. It will override these stop signals and continue to divide. The third pathway is by overriding death signals. Again, a normal cell, if it finds that the conditions around it are too stressful, for example, if there's extensive damage to the DNA, a normal cell will be told to kill itself through a specific death mechanism. And this is a way of regulating growth and regulating the behavior of normal cells. A cancer cell, on the other hand, will override these death signals. And as a result, it will carry on mutations when it should be actually killing itself. And as a result, there's an accumulation of mutations. The fourth hallmark is the stimulation of blood vessels. Now, this is not at the cellular level, but we're zooming out into the tissue level. Like any other tissue, cancer cells also need oxygen, also need glucose to divide and grow. And typically, this is done by stimulating the blood vessels that supply the oxygen and nutrients. So cancer cells release factors that stimulate the expansion of the blood supply network. The fifth pathway is metastasis. When cancer cells move out from the primary location to secondary sites, it could be within the same organ or it could be a distant organ. The point is, cancer cells acquire these unique traits that helps them detach from the primary site and live and survive independently and actually colonize tissue which is remote from its original site. There are other pathways that have also been involved in the cancer development, and these are still to be validated, but there's a lot of growing evidence to support these points, so I'll mention them briefly. One of these is the concept of the cancer stem cells, where we know that some cancers arise because of changes that happen in the programming that stem cells have to undergo to differentiate into specialized cell types. So one school of thought is that cancers arise due to deregulation of the differentiation process. Another point is metabolism. Cancer cells tend to have a high uptake of glucose, unlike most normal cells. So the suggestion is that cancer cells reprogram their metabolic pathway to increase glucose uptake and sustain cell division. And the last point is the immune system. And this is the clever bit where cancer cells actively avoid or escape or hide away from the immune system in the early stages. But later on, as the tumors grow in size, they actively recruit or use the immune cells to sustain their own growth. They stimulate the immune cells to release cytokines and other factors which enables growth and proliferation and spread or metastasis of the cancer cells. So these are some of the key hallmarks of cancer. What we'd like you to take away from this session are two main points. The first one is that understanding that cancers are complex tissues which deregulates some of the main molecular genetic pathways that control normal cell behavior. If we have a handle of how these pathways work, we can design drugs that are specifically targeted at these mutations in cancer cells. In this week and the next week, we'll look at each one of these pathways in more detail